The morning began quiet, with gray light over the small coastal town and the soft hum of a refrigerator in a kitchen that had seen better paint. Grace Porter sat at the table with a chipped mug and stared at the steam. Her phone buzzed on the wood. The screen showed an email from the insurance company. It said her claim had already been processed. It also said the check had been sent to the address on file. Her address was not on the email. The address on file was a street she knew by heart, but it was not where she lived. It was her mother-in-law's house. She did not speak. She pressed her thumb to the screen and read the line again. Already processed. Address on file. Sent. The words felt like rocks in her mouth. She stood up and set the mug in the sink. She turned off the coffee maker and heard the little click that meant the day would have to begin, even if she was not ready. It had been months since her husband Tyler died. The accident happened on a road that cut between pine trees and salt marsh. An afternoon storm had blown through fast, the way storms do near the coast. The sky had gone black, and then teal, and then white again with lightning. He had not been speeding. He had not been drinking. A truck with old tires slid through a yellow light, and that was that. He was 29. He had a smile people talked about. He had a toolbox in the garage with every wrench in its place. He had promised to fix the front steps in June, and then there was no June. There was only a quiet yard and a chair that faced the river that no one sat in. In those first weeks, Grace did what people say to do. She slept on the couch so the bed would not feel like a cliff. She ate toast. She made lists. She went to the funeral home and signed papers with hands that did not feel like her own. The church made casseroles and the neighbors mowed the lawn without asking. The nights were long. The mornings were worse. She would wake and hear the gulls and reach for a body that was not there. She would pause and remember and fold her hand back to her chest and whisper, "Please," just to the air, as if the air could answer. The life insurance was not a secret. Tyler had put the policy in a folder labeled, "If something happens." He had joked when he labeled it because he did not believe in bad luck. The folder lived in a low drawer with tax forms and a stack of birthday cards that had little dogs on them. The policy said a number that looked large when the world was normal. After the accident, it looked like a rope on a cliff. It was not a fortune. It was a bridge to steady ground. It would pay off a small car loan. It would set aside a few months of rent. It would keep the lights on while she found what to do next. The email said the claim had already been processed. It said the check had been mailed to the address on file. The address on file was a white ranch house with blue shutters and a mailbox with seashell stickers 2 miles away. It was where her husband's mother, Margaret, kept stacks of coupon books and a glass bowl full of mints. It was where family photos lined a hallway in neat rows, and it was where Grace had stood after the funeral and listened to quiet comments about what wives should do and how grief could be tidy with enough chores. She scrolled down the email again, her fingers shaking. There was a line for questions. There was a name, Melissa from Claims. There was a number. She tapped it. A soft tone. A menu. Music. Another tone. A cheerful voice said her name, and Grace said hers. She told the story in short words because long words were not working. Her husband died. The claim was filed. She had been waiting. The email said it was processed. The address on file was not her address. The voice on the phone went quiet. The voice asked for the policy number. Grace read it off the page in the folder from the drawer. She heard typing. She heard the pause people make when they know something is not small. Melissa from Claims cleared her throat and said a phrase that felt like cold water. The policy owner of record had updated the mailing address before the claim was approved. The check had been issued and sent. The check had been cashed last week. Grace did not sit down because she did not trust the chair. She did not yell. She did not cry. She asked a question in a voice that sounded like it belonged to a woman who keeps a neat pantry.
Who updated the address? The voice said a name, Margaret Porter. The voice read a line from the file, beneficiary and authorized contact by notarized letter. Grace stared at a crack in the paint on the wall. It ran from the top of the window frame to the baseboard, like a little river that had dried up. She asked the next question. How did she become the authorized contact? The voice on the phone said there was a notarized letter. It was scanned in the file. The signature matched the policy owner's signature. The letter said to route all correspondence to the new mailing address. The letter was signed by Tyler 2 weeks before the accident.
Grace did not remember a letter. She did not remember a notary. She did remember a day 2 weeks before the accident when Margaret had brought over soup and asked to go through the mail to help. She remembered standing at the sink while Margaret opened envelopes with a neat fingernail and set aside what she called junk. Grace remembered thinking it was kind. She also remembered a small, tight feeling in her chest when Margaret kept one envelope in her purse and said she would deliver it later. She had not asked what it was. She had been tired. She had been grateful to have soup. On the phone, the cheerful voice asked if there was anything else she could do to help. Grace said she did not know yet. She thanked the voice. She ended the call and set the phone down. The kitchen clock ticked. A car passed outside and made the glass in the window hum. She held the edge of the table with both hands, like a person standing on a boat. Her neighbor, a retired nurse named Naomi, knocked on the back door at 9 because she always knocked at 9. She wore a windbreaker and carried a bag of oranges. She saw Grace's face and set the bag down and did not ask how things were because she could see how things were. Grace told her the outline in 4 sentences. The claim was processed, the check went to Margaret's house, the letter said it was okay, the letter had Tyler's name. Naomi stood very still. She pressed her lips together and blinked slow. She asked one question. Did you sign anything? Grace said no. Naomi's second question was smaller and sharper. Did you see him sign anything? Grace said no. Naomi nodded once. She reached into the pocket of her windbreaker and pulled out a small spiral notebook. It was the kind given out at conferences and health fairs. It had a pen loop. She wrote the date at the top of the page and then wrote 3 bullets. Insurance claim processed. Check sent to MIL address. Notarized letter from Tyler. She tore off the sheet and handed it to Grace. Start a paper trail, she said. People tell the truth to paper. She left the oranges on the counter. She told Grace to drink water. She said she would be home all day and to knock if she needed a ride. When the door closed, the kitchen was quiet again. Grace folded the paper with the 3 bullets and set it beside the folder labeled, If Something Happens. Then she opened the lower cabinet and pulled out a shoebox where she kept old receipts. She found 2 gel pens and a stack of sticky notes. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a person who needed to make neat piles. The first call she made was to the bank. She asked for a copy of any check in her name that had been cashed in the last 10 days. The teller's voice was kind. The teller said she would look and call back. The second call was to the notary listed in the scan. The number rang to a pharmacy. The pharmacist answered. Grace asked for the notary by name. The pharmacist said the notary worked at the counter on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today was Wednesday. The third call was to the post office to ask about mail forwarding. The clerk said a person can forward mail with a signed form, but the form required proof of identity and a signature. The clerk said if someone had forwarded her mail, she would have received a confirmation letter. Grace had not received one. She went to the drawer where the spare keys lived. The clip with the spare car key was light. The house key was smooth from years of turning. She set them in her pocket, put on her jacket, and walked to the car. The morning was gray with a thin salt smell that comes when the tide is half out. The road to Margaret's house passed a water tower and a diner with a neon sign that flickered. The diner served pancakes the size of plates and eggs that always tasted like butter. Grace did not stop for pancakes. She stopped at a red light and watched a gull ride the air over the lane like a paper scrap. When the light turned green, she did not press the gas hard. She did not want to arrive fast. Margaret's house looked the same as it always looked. The lawn was short because the neighbor boy mowed it with careful lines. The porch had a white bench with a yellow cushion. A wreath with a harvest theme hung on the door, even though the leaves in their town never turned very red. The mailbox with seashell stickers had a flag that stood up straight like a little salute. Grace parked at the curb and sat with her hands on the steering wheel until her fingers hurt. Then she got out and walked up the path that had 3 cracks that Tyler said he would fill before winter. The porch smelt like bleach. She knocked. Margaret opened the door a little and then a lot. She wore a sweater with a pumpkin on it. Her hair was neat. She looked at Grace the way a person looks at a cat at the edge of a yard. She asked if everything was okay in a voice that said she already knew why Grace was there. Grace asked if they could talk at the kitchen table. Margaret looked over her shoulder. She said the table was full of mail. She said they could talk on the porch. Grace did not want to talk on the porch, where neighbors could see the shape of the words and guess the rest. She asked again, soft. Margaret stepped back and held the door. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the inside of a toaster. The table was clean. A candle with a label that said Apple Orchard burned in the corner. Margaret turned off the flame with a little cap and sat. Grace did not. She took the paper with 3 bullets from her pocket and laid it on the table. She did not push it toward anyone. She kept her hand on it like a card in a game she did not know how to play. She said what she knew, in order, without adjectives. The claim was processed. The check was mailed here. There was a notarized letter with Tyler's signature. She asked if Margaret had the check. Margaret's face did not move for a long second. Then it did. It shifted into something between pity and offense. She said the check had come to her because she was handling things. She said Grace had been too sad to make good choices. She said she deposited the check to keep it safe from thieves and from people who prey on widows. She said she had already used some of it for important things. She tapped a stack of envelopes as if they were proof. She said the family had needed help. She said life had to go on. Grace did not look at the envelopes because she did not want to know the names on them yet. She asked what account the money was in. Margaret said her account. She said it was easier to keep it in one place and then distribute what Grace needed when she needed it so she would not spend it all at once. She said it like she was talking about cookies. She sat back in the chair and folded her hands in a way that said, "Be grateful." Grace said one sentence. It was flat. It did not shake. The money was mine. Margaret sighed. She said Tyler would have wanted his mother to help. She said Tyler always trusted her with paperwork. She said she had the letter. She stood and went to a drawer and came back with a photocopy. She slid it across the table. Grace did not pick it up. She read from where she stood. The letter said to route all correspondence to the new mailing address. It said all communication should go through Margaret Porter as authorized contact. It included a signature that looked like Tyler's fast, cheerful scribble. It had a notary stamp that looked real. Grace knew how her husband's hand moved when he wrote his name. She knew the little lift on the R and the way he made a line under the last letter when he was in a hurry. The signature on the photocopy had the right shape, but there was one thing that crawled up her spine like a cold hand. Tyler always put the month before the day because he ran job quotes and invoices, and that habit had become bone. The date on the letter was written as day month, like a person who grew up writing it in a different way. Margaret had traveled a lot. She wrote dates like a person who liked to say she had lived abroad. Grace did not point to the date. She did not argue about the notch on the R. She said another sentence. This time it was softer than before. Please transfer the money to my account by Friday. We will go to the bank together. We will ask the teller to move it. Margaret laughed, a sound like a spoon in a glass. She said that was not necessary. She said Grace did not understand how big bills worked. She said she had already used some of the money to fix the roof at the church and to help a cousin in trouble and to put a deposit on a cruise she had planned with friends to bring joy back into the family after so much sadness. She said there was still plenty. She said they could talk about access. She said boundary. She said responsible. She said words that sounded good in public and used them like walls. Grace had never been loud. She had never been a person who slammed doors. She had always been careful with other people's feelings, even when those people were careless with hers. She stood in a kitchen that smelled like apples and learned something she did not want to learn. She learned that a person can be proud of doing the wrong thing if the room agrees to call it good. She took a breath that felt like lifting a heavy box. She said she would be in touch. She left the house. She did not slam the door. She did not cry on the porch. She nodded to the mailbox with seashell stickers as if it were a witness who could not testify. At home, she made a plan that would fit on a small page. She wrote 3 lines: bank, notary, police. She added a 4th, lawyer. She underlined none of them. She added the word Friday next to bank. She added the word proof next to notary. She added the word report next to police. She added the word consult next to lawyer. She put the paper under a magnet on the refrigerator. The magnet said, "Live simply," and it had a picture of a bicycle with a basket of flowers. The bank called back that afternoon. The teller said a check in her name had been cashed at a branch across town using a provisional endorsement and a letter of authorization. The teller said the endorsement was signed by a person with power of attorney. Grace said no one had power of attorney over her. The teller paused and read a date. The letter of authorization was dated the same day as the notarized letter. The teller said they had scanned copies on file and she could pick them up with the request form. Grace thanked her, put on her jacket, and drove across town. The branch smelled like printer ink and old carpet. The manager had a tie with little boats on it. He printed the copies and handed them over with the serious face a person uses when they do not want to be in the story that is happening in front of them. Grace looked at the pages. The letter had a header with a template that looked like it came from a free website. It used words Tyler would never use, like hereby and pursuant. It said that Margaret had full authority to endorse and deposit any checks related to the policy. It had a signature that looked like Tyler's and a witness signature that looked like J. Lewis. The witness line had no address. The notary stamp was a circle with a number. The date was the same as on the first letter. Grace asked if the bank verified the notary number. The manager said the teller had checked the stamp against the state registry and it matched a notary affiliated with a pharmacy down on River Road. Grace knew that pharmacy. It was the one where she bought toothpaste on sale and the cashier always taped the receipt to the bag. She thanked the manager. She put the copies in a clear plastic sleeve that the manager offered because he saw her hands shake and wanted to offer something that sounded like help. The pharmacy smelled like sunscreen and floor cleaner. The notary desk was at the end of the counter near the blood pressure machine, where kids like to push buttons. A woman with gray hair and square glasses sat on a stool with a pen on a lanyard. The badge on her chest said, Notary Public. Her name was Carol. She looked up and smiled the way people smile when their jobs involve stamps. Grace asked about the date on the letter. She asked if Carol had notarized a letter with Tyler Porter's name 2 weeks before the accident. Carol frowned. She opened a spiral notebook that had a list of names and numbers like a little ship log. She ran her finger down the page. She shook her head. She said she had not seen a Tyler Porter that month. She had seen a Lewis. She tapped the page. J. Lewis notarized 2 documents for a woman named Margaret P. that day. Carol said J. Lewis worked the other shift. Grace asked when J. Lewis would be in. Carol said tomorrow. Grace asked if the notary log could be copied. Carol said only with a request from the police or a lawyer. Carol looked at Grace's face and added that if something was wrong, she should talk to the police. Carol said she had worked here 20 years. She had seen people do strange things when money and grief held hands. Grace drove to the police station because it was lighter in the afternoon than it would be at night, and because she knew if she waited, she would not go. The lobby had a bench and a rack of forms and a bulletin board that said Citizens Academy with a photo of smiling people in polo shirts. A man at the window asked how he could help. He had a soft mustache and a name tag that said Officer Ramirez. Grace told him she needed to file a report or at least talk to someone about a letter, a notary, and a check. She said the words in order. She did not cry. Officer Ramirez listened with his chin in his hand. He nodded slowly. He asked for the copies. He asked for her ID. He said he could take an incident report and that a detective would review it. He did not promise an outcome. He did not promise speed. He promised a case number. He typed with 2 fingers while Grace sat and looked at a poster about hurricane safety. He asked for dates. She gave him dates. He asked for names. She gave him names. He asked if there had been threats. She said no. He asked if there had been requests from money before. She said there had been comments. He asked her to describe the comments. She described them the way a person describes weather. She said there had been a lot of talk about responsibility and family and what a good woman does. Officer Ramirez looked up from the keyboard for a second and met her eyes. He said sometimes the worst kind of theft wears a polite face. He handed her the case number on a small card. He said a detective named Hart would call tomorrow. At home, the afternoon light was weak and flat. She set the card with the case number on the fridge with the bicycle magnet. She wrote Detective Hart next to it. She poured the oranges into a bowl and placed the bowl on the table and looked at them until the color calmed her. She called Naomi and told her what happened in brief notes, like she was leaving a message in a bottle. Naomi said she would come over with soup. Grace said she did not want soup. She wanted quiet. Naomi said she would leave soup on the steps anyway. The phone buzzed in the evening. It was a number she knew but did not have saved. Margaret. The message said to stop making trouble. It said the money was safe. It said family business should stay in the family. It said, talk to me, not to strangers. Grace typed a reply and erased it, and typed another and erased it. She set the phone face down. She stood by the kitchen sink and watched the streetlight come on. She listened to her neighbor's wind chimes count the breeze. At night, the apartment walls clicked as they released the heat they had held all day. The ceiling fan turned slow. Grace lay on the couch with a blanket and stared at the dark line where the ceiling met the wall. She thought about the paper with 3 bullets. She thought about Tyler's laugh. She thought about the way his hand smelled like motor oil and lemon soap. She thought about the letter with the wrong date style and the right shape of a name. She felt anger arrive in her chest like a new animal that would take time to name. She did not push it away. She let it sit. In the morning, Detective Hart called. Her voice was even, with a kind of steadiness that made people tell the truth. She asked Grace to come in with the papers. She asked simple questions and wrote answers down. She said they would talk to the pharmacy. She said they would check the notary's log. She said they would verify the stamp. She said that if a forgery had happened, the bank and the insurance company would need to be notified by law enforcement, not only by a private citizen. She said not to contact Margaret in anger. She said to keep all messages. After the call, Grace made toast and buttered it and ate it standing up. She put on a jacket and went to the law office above the florist on Main Street. The sign on the door said Mercer and Pike. The waiting room smelt like lilies. A receptionist took her name and offered water in a paper cup. The lawyer who met her was a woman with sharp eyes and soft hands. Her name was Ellen Pike. She wore a navy blazer and listened without blinking. She asked to see the papers. She traced the circle of the notary stamp with her finger. She asked about the date. She asked about the family history in a way that did not feel like gossip. Ellen Pike said the words power of attorney like a warning and then a lesson. She explained that power of attorney ends at death. She explained that letters that give someone authority to act can be narrow or broad. She explained that if someone used a forged letter to gain control of a check, it was a crime. She explained what a civil action could look like if the money had already been spent. She said people spend money fast when it is not theirs. She said the law moves slow, but not always too late. She said a police report would help. She said to gather bank statements and any texts where Margaret talked about the money. She said to be ready to show who paid for what in the months since the accident. She said judges like clean lines. Grace nodded. She felt both heavy and light. She thanked the lawyer and said she would bring what she had. Ellen said her assistant would email a checklist and an engagement letter. Grace walked down the stairs and out into air that smelled like roses and street dust. She checked her phone. A message from Naomi. A pot of soup on your step. Do not argue. A message from an unknown number. We need to talk before you do something you regret. Margaret again, from a different phone. Grace did not reply. She took the soup inside and set it on the stove and did not lift the lid. She pulled a plastic storage bin from under the bed and filled it with paper. Bank statements, utility bills, receipts for the funeral home, the policy, original, the tax folder, the folder with Tyler's pay stubs from last spring. She lined them up in rows and columns like a patient person making a quilt. She put sticky notes on each stack with months and short labels. She created a timeline that began the day Tyler died and ran to the present, with lines from money in and money out. She did not add adjectives to the numbers. She put numbers in boxes and boxes in order. At noon, she drove back to the pharmacy. Carol waved her over and pointed to the small office door behind the counter. A man with a shaved head and a gentle face met her. His badge said J. Lewis. He looked like a person people tell secrets to at bus stops. He asked how he could help. Grace told him she had a question about a notarized letter 2 weeks before her husband's accident. He flipped open the log. He read the page. He nodded. He said he remembered the woman because she wore a scarf with little anchors on it and she talked the whole time about being in a hurry. He said the woman signed as Margaret P. He said there was a second signature on the witness line because she said she needed a witness for a bank later. He said he had told her the witness line was not necessary for the notary, but she insisted. He said he had witnessed the signature on his log, not on the letter. He said the man who signed was not present. He said the woman told him the man could not come because he was at work, but that he had signed earlier and she just needed the stamp. He said he had told her he could not stamp a letter signed by someone not in front of him. He said he had therefore not stamped that letter. He said he had stamped a different document that day, a copy of a driver's license. He showed the log. It matched what he said. Grace swallowed. She asked if he would be willing to tell the police what he just told her. He said yes. He said he would write a statement. He said he did not like when people tried to bend rules like paper clips. Grace thanked him. She walked to the car with her hands in her pockets because they were shaking again. Detective Hart called in the afternoon. She had already spoken to the pharmacy. She asked Grace to bring the documents down for scanning. She asked if Grace felt safe. Grace said yes. Detective Hart said to avoid direct confrontations. She said to keep communications in writing. She said she would reach out to the insurance company and the bank with the case number. On Thursday, Margaret posted a photo on social media of a porch with a view of water. The caption said, "Sometimes you have to take a breath and invest in joy." There was a line of small hearts and 2 comments from friends with waves emojis. Grace looked at the photo for 5 seconds and then closed the app. She walked to the sink and washed the 1 plate and the 1 mug she used that day. She wiped the counter with a dish towel that had little lemons on it. She sat at the table and breathed in and out, and did not allow her mind to build a scene where she demanded the world return to what it knew. On Friday morning, the bank appointment she had scheduled for herself came at 9. She met with a teller named Brianna, who had nails painted pale pink and a way of speaking that made stress slow down. Grace asked about freezing any account with her name. Brianna said she could flag her profile for fraud alerts. She did. She also helped Grace open a new account with a new number and recommended alerts for any change of address. She printed a sheet with all the steps someone could take to keep accounts safe after a death, because people sometimes do things when grief makes them think time will not see them. She gave the sheet to Grace and circled 3 lines. Grace thanked her and put the sheet in the clear sleeve with the other papers. At noon, Grace stood in her living room and looked at the neat piles and felt a kind of calm that she did not trust yet. She ate a slice of toast with honey and answered a message from Ellen's assistant with scanned copies of the documents. She labeled the files with dates and short, plain names, because she had learned that clarity is a kindness to your future self. Then she walked down to the river and stood by the path where the wind always smelt like salt and rain. She watched a small boat move slow across the water and thought about how speed and direction are not the same thing. In the evening, Naomi sat on the couch and held a mug while they watched a game show with the sound low. Naomi asked if Grace had eaten. Grace said yes. Naomi asked if she wanted to come to the farmer's market on Saturday. Grace said maybe. Naomi nodded. She did not say everything would be okay, because she had lived long enough to know that okay is a moving target. She said she was proud of Grace for writing things down. She said the first step out of a trap is knowing where the floor cracks. Saturday brought a message from Margaret that said the detective had called and made a scene. It said, "How dare you?" It said, "Family first." It said, "Betrayal." It said words that were meant to make Grace feel small and heavy. Grace read the message once and then again. She opened a new note in her phone and typed the words and quotes with the time and date. She did not reply. She put the phone face down and opened the window and let the air in. On Sunday, church bells rang in the distance. Grace did not go. She sat at the table and wrote a letter to herself. She wrote it as if she were writing to a friend she loved. It said, "You did not cause this." It said, "You are allowed to ask for what is yours." It said, "You can be kind and still say no." It said, "You do not owe your silence to anyone who uses it to take from you." She folded the letter and put it in the folder with the policy. She closed the drawer and set her hand on the wood for a second, as if to say thank you to a piece of furniture for holding what it held. Monday morning, Detective Hart called again. She said the insurance company had put a hold on any further disbursements related to the policy. She said they had flagged the file for potential fraud. She said the bank had been notified to preserve footage of deposits from the week the check cleared. She said progress would be measured in steps, not leaps. She asked if Grace would be willing to come in to sign a statement. Grace said yes. She hung up and looked at the list on the refrigerator. Bank, notary, police, lawyer. She put a small check mark next to the first 3. She did not draw a line through them. She let the checks stand like small lights. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind moved the trees in a way that made them look like dancers bowing. A storm came in from the bay with a sheet of rain so thick the world looked drawn with a soft pencil. Grace watched the rain hit the street and bounce. She thought about the road where the accident happened. She thought about storms that come fast and leave slow. She thought about what Margaret had said about joy and about safety and about how a person can hold up a word like a shield to hide a different word behind it. Her phone buzzed. It was a number she did not know. She let it go to voicemail. The voice was male, smooth, and professional. It said his name was Alan Craig, and he represented Margaret in a family matter. He asked that Grace refrain from further contact with banks or agencies and allowed them to resolve this internally. He said the check had been handled in good faith. He said any claim of fraud would be defended. He said, "Call me back by end of day." He said the kind of phrases that sound like doors closing when you stand in a hallway. Grace did not call back. She forwarded the voicemail to Ellen. She forwarded it to Detective Hart. Then she sat at the table and folded her hands and looked at the oranges until the sound of rain on the window softened. In the evening, she drove to the store and bought bread, eggs, butter, and a small box of tea with a picture of a mountain on it. She parked far from the door and walked in the wet because the walk felt like a thing she could decide. At the checkout, the clerk, a teenager with hair the color of new pennies, asked how her night was. Grace said it was okay. The clerk smiled like a person who has not learned yet that okay can hold multitudes. Grace smiled back because she did not want to hand the girl her brief. When she reached her apartment, there was an envelope on the mat with no return address. It was thick. Inside was a printed letter with a law firm letterhead that matched the name in the voicemail. It was a cease and desist. It said, "Stop defaming." It said, "Do not contact." It said, "Legal action." It said words in all caps. Grace read it once and then put it in a sleeve and labeled it with the date and a note that said, "Tone, threat." She did not feel afraid in the way she had expected. She felt tired and clear. At night, she dreamed a simple dream. She was in a small boat with no motor on a wide river. The current was steady. She held an oar and moved the boat a few inches left and a few inches right. On the shore, a woman shouted that the boat belonged to her. Grace kept the oar in the water and let the current carry her forward. She woke with the feeling in her chest that forward was not fast, but it was real. On Tuesday, Naomi drove her to the police station for the statement because the rain had left the street slick, and Naomi believed in good tires, but also in caution. The station smelled like coffee again and something like toner. Detective Hart brought them into a small room with a table and 2 chairs and the kind of light that makes people honest. Grace signed her statement. She handed over the voicemail and the cease and desist letter. Detective Hart read the letter and raised an eyebrow. She said sometimes people write loud letters when their position is quiet. She said the investigation would continue. She said the notary statements would be helpful. She said the bank footage was pending. On the way home, Naomi stopped at the diner with the neon sign that flickered. They ordered pancakes the size of plates and took half home and took the rest in a box. Naomi said when all this was over, they would paint Grace's kitchen a color that looked like morning. Grace said she did not know what morning looked like anymore. Naomi said it looked like light coming back and having a place to land. That afternoon, Grace got an email from Ellen's office with a draft complaint to file if the criminal case stalled. It was written in quiet, strong sentences. It asked for the return of funds. It asked for damages. It laid out the facts with no adjectives. It read like it had a spine. Grace printed it and read it out loud once. She stumbled on one line where her name sat next to the word plaintiff. It felt strange to be a person in a document. It felt like walking into a room and seeing yourself in a mirror you did not know was there. She put the pages back in the sleeve and placed the sleeve in the bin under the bed. Evening brought a sky that turned clear and then soft blue. Children rode bikes in the parking lot and counted each other's jumps over a painted line. A dog barked at a squirrel. Life continued around her in small, steady ways. She made an omelet and burned the first one and laughed at herself because the laugh was better than the sigh that tried to come. She ate the second one and drank tea from the box with the mountain and thought about how mountains look solid from far away, and then you put your hand on the rock and you feel the sand in it. At 9, her phone buzzed again. A message from Margaret. It said a simple sentence. "We raised him, not you." The words hit like a tiny stone tossed at a window. It did not break. Grace folded the phone. She typed 4 words and erased them. Then she typed 3 more and erased them. Then she typed 2 and kept them. She wrote, "Stop contacting me." She hit send. She put the phone in a drawer and closed it. Wednesday morning, the world smelled like wet pine. Detective Hart called at 10. She said the bank footage showed Margaret walking to the counter with the man who looked like the witness on the letterhead, Alan Craig. He was not just a lawyer on the phone. He had been there when the check was deposited. He placed his card on the counter and leaned in while Margaret spoke. The video had no sound, but sometimes pictures speak loud. Detective Hart said the bank would be providing affidavits. She said the case would go to the district attorney for review. She said not to post about it online. She said to keep breathing. Grace thanked her. She sat very still for a long minute and then stood up and opened the window. The air that came in felt like a blanket left on a line. She took the letter to herself from the folder and read it again. "You do not owe your silence." She folded it and smiled a little because the handwriting looked like a different woman's. A woman with clean shoes who stands up straight in photos without thinking about where to put her hands. That afternoon, Naomi and Grace went through the last of the papers. They found a receipt from the pharmacy for a photocopy fee dated the day of the letter. They put it in the timeline. They found a note in Margaret's handwriting from 3 months ago that said, "Bring bill to me, I will handle." They put it in the timeline. They put the timeline in a binder because a binder felt like a thing people carry when they go to rooms where decisions are made. As evening fell, a pink streak cut across the sky and then faded like a shy smile. Grace sat on the porch steps with a blanket over her lap and looked at the parking lot lights blink on one by one. She realized she had spent months holding her breath in small ways. Now, each inhale felt like practice. Each exhale felt like choosing. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of a cruise brochure with a circle around a cabin number and a note that said, "Deposit non-refundable." Then another line, "You made me do this." The number was blocked before she could answer. Grace screenshotted the text and emailed it to Ellen and to Detective Hart. She put the phone face down and looked at the dark patch of sky where the stars were shy near town. Night laid a quiet hand on the little apartment. Inside, the binder sat on the table next to the bowl of oranges. The bicycle magnet on the fridge held a small stack of new cards with names and numbers, all in neat rows. The card at the top had the case number. It glowed a little in the light from the stove. Grace stood, turned off the light, and let the dark be simple, not a thing to fear. Morning would come, it always did, and with it steps. Not all at once, not loud, just steady, like a person walking toward a door she has the right to open. The next morning, a thin fog lifted off the river and rolled over the streets like slow breath. Grace woke before her alarm and lay still, listening to the quiet. She could feel the shape of the week ahead. It felt like a road with signs she could finally read. She got up, made coffee, and ate toast over the sink. When she finished, she rinsed the plate, set it in the rack, and looked at the binder on the table. She placed her palm flat on the cover for a second, like a promise made to herself. Detective Hart called at 9. The bank footage had been copied. The notarized log pages had been secured. The pharmacy employees would provide statements. She kept her voice even and matter of fact. She used short sentences. She told Grace the district attorney's office would review the file that afternoon. She said the case would not be settled in a day. She said that did not mean the case was weak. It meant the system had steps. She asked Grace to hold on. Grace thanked her. She put the phone down and sat. She looked out the window and watched a delivery truck back into a space, the driver moving slow, checking mirrors, turning the wheel half an inch at a time. The truck stopped with the back bumper lined up to the painted dock like a picture in a book. It looked simple because it was careful. Grace took a breath. Care could be a kind of strength. At noon, Ellen called from the law office. Her tone carried a light energy, as if she had found a piece of the puzzle that fit clean. She had spoken with the insurance company. They would accept a formal demand to place a hold on dispersed funds pending the criminal review. It would not pull money back yet, but it would mark those dollars like paint marks on trees before a storm. The law firm would file a civil complaint with a request for temporary relief if needed. Ellen asked if Grace wanted to move. Grace said yes. Ellen then asked for one more thing. She asked if Grace would be willing to meet the next day at the courthouse hallway, not for a hearing, but to prepare for one. They would outline testimony and arrange exhibits. They would bring the binder and label the tabs so cleanly that a judge could find answers faster than questions. Grace said she would be there. Ellen said bring a sweater, because the building was cold. The afternoon ran quiet until 3. Then a message came from Margaret. It was longer than the others. It had too many commas and a tone that thought it sounded reasonable. It said the cruise deposit was healing. It said the roof of the church was a blessing. It said nice words in a row like a necklace of glass beads. It ended with a warning. If you keep this up, people will think you are unwell. Grace did not type back. She screenshotted it and filed it in a folder named Messages. She closed the drawer and went for a walk. The river showed a slight chop, little white tips on small waves. A boy tossed bread to gulls. A woman in a blue coat walked a terrier who had a pink bow above one ear. Grace stood at the railing and watched a barge move past. It was slow and made a deep sound like a low bell. She thought about how heavy things move. Not fast, but sure. She walked home feeling like she had a center again. That night, Naomi brought a loaf of bread and a jar of jam that tasted like summer. They ate small slices and watched the news on mute. Naomi asked if Grace wanted company at the courthouse. Grace said she did. Naomi nodded. She said she would bring a small bag with tissues and mints and a tiny bottle of hand lotion because her mother taught her that dry hands make people feel worse in hard rooms. Grace smiled at that. It was a small thing. Small things kept the floor under her feet. Morning came bright and clear. The courthouse steps were wide and had a rail in the middle where older men liked to lean and talk about weather. Inside, the floor was shiny. People's footsteps made soft tapping sounds. Grace wore a simple black sweater and carried the binder like a school book. Ellen waited by a bench with a stack of sticky flags and a pen that clicked. They sat. They talked through facts. They decided what pieces of paper would speak first if they had to speak at all. Ellen practiced questions with Grace. What was the date of the accident? When did you receive the email? Who has the policy? Did you authorize anyone to receive the check? Grace answered in clean words, the way she would read instructions from a box. She found a rhythm. She did not add extra. She did not explain how autumn air felt in her chest or how sadness had pushed her to be still. She answered the question and trusted the paper to carry the rest. Naomi waited at the end of the hall with a small smile and a thermos of tea. She handed Grace a cup when they took a break. Ellen showed Grace how to place the binder on the table so it opened to the right tab. She said judges like order. She said order is kindness in a room built for tension. Grace nodded. Kindness could be quiet and still be strong. At noon, Ellen's phone buzzed. She stepped aside and answered. When she returned, her face was calm, but a small light had come into her eyes. The district attorney's office had accepted the case for review. They would not file charges yet, but they would present it to a charging committee on Friday. They needed Margaret's statement and the lawyer's explanation on record. Ellen expected the lawyer would try to avoid it. She expected a call. The call arrived at 3. Alan Craig's voice carried that smooth tone again. He asked to work it out privately. He suggested a meeting without police. He suggested that misunderstandings had ballooned. He said words like de-escalate and family solution. Ellen did not use soft words. She said there would be no private meetings. She said return of funds or court. She said her client would not be shamed back into silence. She said put it in writing. Silence sat on the line. Then he said he would discuss with his client and call tomorrow. Ellen hung up and looked at Grace. She said sometimes people think a neat letter can cancel a mess. She said mess takes more than a letter. She said, be ready. Grace nodded and felt the thin thread of fear move in her again. She did not reject it. Fear was a visitor who could sit on the porch and not be invited in. She went home and cooked pasta and ate half and saved half. She took the binder out and dusted it like it was a piece of furniture. She set it on the shelf. She took a shower and let the hot water hit her shoulders until her skin turned pink. The next day, something small changed. A letter came in the mail, addressed to her, with her name spelled right, and the street right, and the apartment number right. Inside was a notice from the insurance company. The claim was being reviewed for irregularities. A hold had been placed on any funds that could be recovered. Please keep all communication. Please notify us of any contact. Grace held the paper and let the weight of it sit in her hands. It was not a finish line. It was a sign on the road that said, "You are not imagining this." She placed the letter in the binder. She added a tab labeled Insurer. At noon, her phone rang and showed Margaret's number. Grace did not answer. A voicemail arrived. Margaret's voice sounded tight, like a rope pulled too hard. She said the bank had called about the footage. She said the police had called. She said her friends were asking questions. She said Grace was ungrateful. She said Grace did not understand how hard raising a son was. She said money was complicated. She said she had done nothing wrong. She said too many words, and none of them were sorry. Grace sent the voicemail to Ellen and to Detective Hart. Then she opened the window and let fresh air in. She made tea and held the mug in both hands. She thought about the time soon after the wedding when Margaret had commented on the price of flowers. She had said roses were a waste and that daisies lasted longer. She had said sensible women choose daisies. Grace had laughed then and let it slide. Now, she thought about how people sometimes dress control as thrift. She set the mug down and stood straighter. Friday arrived with the sky so blue it almost looked like paint. Ellen called early. The charging committee had asked follow-up questions. They wanted to know if Margaret had been told not to deposit the check before she did. They wanted to know if there was any text where she mentioned doing it. Grace searched her phone, fingers fast but careful. She found it. A message from weeks ago, right after the accident. Margaret had asked, awkward in tone, if she could handle the big check when it came to save Grace the trouble. Grace had replied, "Thank you, but I will handle my own mail." Margaret had answered with a thumbs up emoji. Ellen read the lines twice. She said this was important. She said it was a clear boundary set. She said screens are witnesses with good memory. She forwarded the screen capture to Detective Hart. Hart replied with one word, "Received." The city moved on around them the way cities do when a small war happens in a small apartment. People went to work and bought coffee and waved at neighbors. Inside, the binder waited like a steady friend. In the afternoon, the phone rang again. Ellen answered on speaker with Grace beside her. Alan Craig's tone had changed. He used fewer soft words. He asked if a settlement was possible. He floated a number that was less than half the policy. He called it a compromise. Ellen did not change her voice. She said the demand was the full amount, less any documented, agreed expenses paid for Grace's benefit, none of which had been shown. She said there would be an accounting. She said their position had not changed. He asked for time. Ellen gave him until Monday at noon. She said if funds were not returned, they would file a civil action and proceed. She said a criminal referral was active. He said that would be a shame. She said the shame was earlier. That night, Grace did a simple thing that felt big. She walked to the bakery with the bell on the door and bought a small chocolate cake with white frosting. The woman behind the counter boxed it like a precious thing and tied a ribbon. Grace carried it home and set it on the table and did not cut it yet. She looked at it as if it were a small flag on a hill she had climbed. She would share it with Naomi tomorrow. They would eat slices with forks and drink tea and talk about nothing for 20 minutes. 20 minutes could be a holiday. Saturday morning, Margaret stood on Grace's porch. She did not knock at first. She paced. She folded her arms and unfolded them. Grace saw the shadow under the door and knew the shape. She took a breath and opened it. Margaret stepped back half a step, surprised, as if she expected a lock to speak for Grace. She started fast, the way a person starts when they fear the other person will hang up. She said the words she thought would work. She said, "Think of family." She said, "I paid for his headstone." She said, "My friends will hear." She said, "Your father-in-law is embarrassed." She said, "If you keep going, no one will forgive you." Grace leaned on the frame and held the door with one hand and the edge of herself with the other. She listened without interrupting. When Margaret stopped for air, Grace spoke. Her words were simple and flat and kind without giving ground. She said, "Return the money." She said, "Speak to my lawyer." She said, "Do not come to my door again without notice." She said, "I won't discuss this in hallways or on porches." She said, "I wish none of this had happened." She said, "I'm still allowed to stand up." Margaret's jaw moved like a small machine trying to lift something heavy. She blinked. She whispered one word, "Please." And the sound was new, like a note from a different song. Grace did not move. She said, "I am not your enemy." She said the money was mine. She said his name and let it hang in the air between them like a picture. Margaret looked away first. She said she needed time. Grace said Monday at noon. She closed the door and put her forehead against it and counted to 10. She did not cry. She went to the kitchen and cut the cake and wrapped 2 plates and carried them to Naomi's door. They ate on the porch steps under a sky that looked close enough to touch. Sunday was quiet. Grace washed sheets and hung them to dry on a rack by the window because it made the apartment smell like sun. She watered the plant Naomi had given her, the one that did not mind if you forgot it for a week, the one that forgave. She read a book from the library about women who learned to repair engines during war, and she smiled at the photos of hands in grease and sleeves rolled to elbows. She kept her phone nearby, but not in her hand. It buzzed twice with numbers she did not know. She let them go to voicemail. She would forward them to Ellen if they were more letters made of voice. Monday morning, the town wore a light coat of cloud, like a shirt on a clothesline waiting to be ironed by the sun. Ellen called at 9. No funds had arrived. She filed the civil complaint at 10. She emailed Grace a copy with the case number in bold at the top. The document read like a clean room. The paragraphs were lined up straight. The words were steady. Return of funds. Unauthorized endorsement, conversion, fraud. The complaint asked for a freeze on the margins of a cruise reservation, a hold on transfers, and accounting of expenses. It listed the exhibits. It spoke like a person with both feet on the ground. At noon, Alan called again. His voice held a new thread, worry. He said his client was ready to discuss return. He asked for a meeting that afternoon in his office. Ellen agreed on one condition. The meeting would include a neutral notary. It would include a written agreement. It would include a cashier's check. He sighed. He said he would see what he could do. At 2, they sat in a glass-walled room on the 8th floor of a building that looked like it wanted to be a bank. The table was long enough for 12. Only 4 chairs were filled. Ellen sat with Grace. Across from them, Alan sat with Margaret. Margaret looked smaller than she had on Grace's porch. Her sweater was perfect. Her hands twisted a tissue into a rope. She did not look at Grace. Alan began. He talked first about sadness and confusion, about grief doing odd things, about intentions and misunderstandings. He used words like unfortunate and regrettable. Ellen did not interrupt. She waited. He placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside sat a cashier's check, crisp and heavy. He slid it forward so they could read the amount. It was close to the full policy value, less a list of urgent family expenses that included the church roof, the cruise to Gazet, and a payment to a cousin. Ellen looked at the list and then at the exhibits prepared in the binder. She spoke in a voice that could cut paper. She said no item on that list was authorized by Grace. She said the check should match the full amount. She said any family expenses would be discussed later if there were receipts and proof that the expenditures benefited Grace. She pushed the list back. She pushed the cashier's check back. She said full amount. Alan's jaw tightened. Margaret made a small sound, like a sigh that lost its way. She whispered that the deposit was non-refundable. Ellen kept her eyes on Alan. She said non-refundable is not a magic word. She said a crime does not become legal because a company keeps a deposit. She said, again, full amount. The room went quiet. Outside the glass, a woman with a red scarf walked down the hall and looked in and looked away fast. Alan sat still and moved only his eyes. Margaret whispered, her voice small now. She said she only wanted to make things easier. She said she thought money would fix the parts of life that felt broken. She said Tyler always called her when he had a question about paperwork. She said she thought she was helping. Grace listened. Her heart held 2 things at once, the old wish to soothe and the new strength not to. She folded her hands where Ellen could see them. Ellen placed her palm on the table near Grace's, not touching, but there. Alan stood and left the room with his folder to make a call. The door clicked shut. The city noise came faint through the glass. Margaret looked at Grace and then looked at the table. She said she missed him. She said his room still smelled like laundry and cologne. She said she went in there at night and sat. She said she could not stand the quiet. Grace heard the truth in those lines. She also heard the missing words. I am sorry. She waited. Alan came back with a new check. He placed it on the table. The amount matched the full policy. He also placed a short agreement that said funds were returned under dispute, without admission. Ellen read each word. She crossed out a line that tried to limit future claims. She added a line about preserving evidence. She handed it back. Alan sighed and signed. Margaret signed with a hand that shook. Grace signed only to acknowledge receipt. The notary stamped the page. The stamp made a soft thump, a sound like a door closing on a wind. They stood. No one hugged, no one smiled. Ellen slid the check into a folder and placed it in her bag. She shook Alan's hand the way a person shakes a hand when business is done and only the calendar remains. Grace looked at Margaret. She felt the strange weight of both endings and beginnings. She said a sentence she did not plan but was true. She said, I hope you find quiet that is not built on taking. Margaret flinched, a small movement, like a shadow shifting under a cloud. She nodded once. She left with Alan. In the elevator, Ellen pressed the shiny button for the first floor with one finger and exhaled through her nose. She said, very soft, good. Then she said, still soft, not over. She explained that a criminal case could still go forward. She explained that a judge might still want to see facts. She explained that a civil action for damages could continue. She explained that even when money comes back, trust does not, and the law could not make a new heart in anyone's chest. Grace nodded. She did not expect the law to make a new heart. She expected the law to mark the road. Outside, the air felt clean. Naomi waited on the bench with a paper bag from the bakery. She stood and handed it to Grace. Inside were 2 cookies and a note that said, "You did a hard thing well." They sat there for a minute. Cars moved, people walked. Someone laughed a block away. The world had room again. That night, Grace deposited the check with Ellen at the bank branch downtown, the one with high ceilings and a mural of ships. They stood at a desk while a teller typed and checked and typed again. The teller smiled the kind of smile that is quiet and respectful. The deposit went through. Ellen handed Grace a receipt in a sleeve. They walked out under the mural. The painted ships looked like they were sailing somewhere known. On the drive home, Grace took a different street on purpose, a street that ran past the road where the accident had happened. She slowed by the turn where the pines lean in. She did not stop. She did not pull over. She did not take her hands off the wheel. She spoke his name under her breath. It came out like a prayer, and a hello, and a goodbye pressed into one small word. She kept driving. Days began to stack up in better rows. The district attorney's office filed a charge for fraudulent endorsement. It was not a dramatic event. It was a packet of paper handed across a counter, a date set, a notice mailed. The investigation would take months. Ellen asked if Grace wanted to attend any hearings. Grace said she would attend the first and then decide. She did not want to live in courtrooms. She wanted to live in her kitchen and at the river and in the simple places where sunlight landed. Margaret did not call. She sent one letter through her lawyer. It said she would repay the cruise deposit when the company allowed. It said she would make a donation to the church roof from her own account. It said she regretted stress. The letter did not say sorry. Grace put it in the binder under a tab called correspondence. She found the act of filing it calm. Paper belongs in places. So do people. As weeks turned into a month, small things bloomed. Grace started an evening routine. She would make tea and write for 20 minutes in a notebook with a soft cover. Sometimes she wrote a list of tasks and checked boxes with satisfaction. Sometimes she wrote memories of Tyler, simple and exact. The way he drummed his fingers when he waited for water to boil. The way he said the word "all right" like a promise. The way he would leave one spoon in the drawer crooked by accident, and how she would pretend to be annoyed, and how neither of them ever fixed it because it felt like a signature inside the house. Naomi introduced Grace to a friend who ran a community class on money basics at the library. They needed someone to help organize handouts and greet people at the door. The work was small and good. Grace made name tags and lined up pens on the table and welcomed people as they came in, their faces a mix of tired and hopeful. She listened as the instructor talked about budgets like maps and accounts like boxes you label with a marker, and how the first step to taking care of yourself is looking at the numbers without shame. Grace did not speak much. When she did, she spoke softly, and people leaned in to hear. A month later, something happened that felt like weather changing. Grace got an envelope with the county seal. Inside was a notice for a hearing date in the criminal case. She placed it on the table and stared at the black text on white. She felt the old shake and the new steady in the same breath. She told Naomi. She told Ellen. She did not tell Margaret. She did not need to. The system would tell her. The morning of the hearing, Grace wore a plain dress and the sweater that had become her uniform. Ellen met her at the courthouse. The hallway held the usual mix of nerves and coffee, and people trying to remember where they put their patience. Margaret stood at the far end with Ellen. She wore a dark coat and a string of pearls. She did not look at Grace at first. When she did, her eyes looked older than her face. Inside the courtroom, the judge called names. Papers shuffled. The air conditioning clicked. The case was not a trial. It was a step. The charge was stated. The defense asked for time. The state asked for conditions. The judge set the next date and told both sides to exchange discovery. It took 12 minutes. 12 minutes for months of pain. 12 minutes for a woman to stand behind a table and hear her name linked to a word that would not hide behind family any longer. When the judge left, the room relaxed. People stood and sat and filed out. Margaret stayed in her seat for a second after others moved. Then she stood and walked to the aisle and paused as if she had been told to stand in a particular square. Grace stepped aside to let another person pass and found herself near Margaret without meaning to be. They stood 2 feet apart, close enough to see the small lines near each other's eyes. Margaret spoke first. Her voice was a whisper and broke twice before the sentence ended. She said, "I did not think it would go this far." Grace answered in a tone that held no fire and no ice. She said, "You took it far when you took what was mine." Margaret's mouth opened and closed. She nodded once and looked down at her hands. She said, "I miss him." Grace said, "I do too." The truth sat between them like a stone and a flower, both at once. They walked away. The doors closed behind them with a soft thud. Outside, the day looked ordinary. It was a mercy. Life bent toward normal again, though normal had a new shape. Grace paid her bills and watched her account without fear. She bought a better chair for the small desk by the window. She framed one photo of Tyler, the one on the old pier with wind in his hair and the grin that made you think the day had agreed to be a good day, and set it on the shelf. She did not build a shrine. She built a life. Once a week, she helped at the library class. Women would come up after and ask small questions in low voices. "How do I tell my sister no?" How do I stop paying my cousin's credit card? How do I move my own check into my own account? Grace would say the smallest true thing. She would say, write it down. She would say, start today. She would say, you are allowed. She would say, make a binder. People laughed when she said binder and then stopped laughing when they saw her face, how sure it had become. Spring pushed at the edges of town with green and ditches and new leaves on trees that had looked tired. Grace planted basil in a small pot and put it on the sill. Naomi started walking longer and Grace went with her. They pointed at birds and argued about their names. They met a dog who loved them on sight. They pet him like he was made of magic because sometimes dogs are. One evening, the doorbell rang. Grace opened it to find an envelope on the mat and no one in the hall. She lifted it and checked for a return address. There was none. Inside was a simple note on plain paper in Margaret's handwriting. It said, I am sorry. The letters were neat but shaky. No long defense, no commas like sandbags. 2 words. Grace stood with the note in her hand and felt her body ask a question it did not need to answer right away. She carried the note to the table and set it next to the binder. She did not file it yet. She let it sit in the open like a guest she was deciding whether to invite to stay. She did not call. She did not rush to accept or reject. The next day, she took the note to Ellen and asked how to hold this. Ellen smiled with the tiny smile of a person who has seen many kinds of paper. She said, you can accept the apology without moving the line. She said, you can let that note be true and still keep your doors locked at night. Grace nodded. She put the note under the magnet on the fridge for a week. Then she moved it into the binder with a tab that simply said, personal. By summer, the criminal case reached an end that was neither a storm nor a parade. Margaret accepted a plea to a lesser charge, returned fees the court said were due, did community service at a thrift store downtown, and took a class on ethics that made her roll her eyes, but also made her think. She did not go to jail. She did not lose her house. She did not host parties for a while. She learned how to fold men's shirts so the sleeves line up, and how to listen when people tell stories while they shop for cups. Grace did not attend the last hearing. She read the summary on a piece of paper. She breathed in and out and let the paper be just paper. She made dinner. She watered the basil. She called Naomi to ask if she wanted to split a peach. Naomi said she would be over in 5. On a Sunday in late summer, Grace drove out to the state road where a new marker had been placed near the curve. It was small and simple and had Tyler's name in the dates. People sometimes left flowers. Someone had stuck a tiny flag there on a holiday. Today, there was only wind. Grace stood with both hands on the top of the marker and felt the cool stone. She talked out loud the way people do when no one is around and the air feels like a friend. She said it was hard. She said it was better. She said, I wish you were here. She said, I did the best I knew. She said, I think you would be proud. On the way back, she stopped at the diner with the flickering neon and ate eggs that tasted like butter. The waitress refilled her coffee and told her about a dog that had delivered 7 puppies in the back of a truck. Grace laughed at the right parts. She left a tip that made the waitress blink and say thank you twice. Outside, the sky was the color of quiet. Autumn came again, as it always does. Leaves did what they could do in a coastal town, which was not much, but the air still changed. The night drew in early. People bought candles and pretended the dim was cozy. Someone down the hall put a wreath on their door. Someone else tried to string lights around a balcony rail and tied a knot they would regret. A week before Thanksgiving, a card came. It was not from Margaret. It was from the church secretary, who had tidy handwriting and a heart as big as the fellowship hall. It invited Grace to a small service of thanks for those who had lost someone and those who had helped them stand. There would be tea and pie. Grace went. She brought napkins and a smile. She sat next to Naomi and listened as people told 2-minute stories about finding their breath again. When it was her turn, she stood and spoke 12 sentences. She said her husband died in a rainstorm. She said she had learned that sorrow is not a job to finish. She said she had learned that boundaries and love are not enemies. She said she had learned to write things down. She said she was grateful for a neighbor who leaves soup and knocks gently. She said she was grateful for cashiers and nurses and tellers and detectives who do their work steady and plain. She sat down to a room of quiet faces and felt something strong and gentle rise inside her like tide water touching a dock. After the service, she stepped outside and found Margaret standing on the steps. Not too close, not too far. She held a small plant in a paper sleeve, a peace lily with one white bloom. She looked at Grace and lifted the plant as if it were a question. Grace paused. She took the plant. She said, "Thank you." Margaret said, "I am working on it." Grace said, "Me too." They did not talk about holidays. They did not talk about who cooked what and who sat where. They stood under a sky that had decided to be kind for 15 minutes and just let the wind move around them. The next morning, Grace made coffee and set the peace lily on the sill. She opened the binder and looked at the tabs like old friends. Then she closed it and slid it into the closet. It did not need to be on the table anymore. It did not need to be a centerpiece. It could be a book on a shelf, not a shield on her arm. She walked to the river and watched the gulls wheel and cry and dive. A man threw a line in the water and pulled it back and laughed when he caught nothing. A woman taught a child to ride a bike on the path, her hand steady on the seat until it wasn't, and then the child wobbled and did not fall. A breeze combed the surface of the water in little lines of silver. Grace stood there in a coat that fit better now because her shoulders were no longer held up by worry. She thought about how love had not gone away. It had changed shape. It had become a practice, not a bargain. It had become a kitchen table with room for a bowl of oranges and a plant and a notebook. It had become the ability to say yes and no with the same calm voice. That evening, she recorded an audio message for the library class. It was simple. She said, "If you are holding too much for too many, write it down." She said, "If someone tells you your voice is trouble, speak to the paper first, then speak to the person, then speak to the room if you must." She said, "If someone takes from you and calls it love, check the numbers." She said, "You are not less kind because you protect yourself. You are not less good because you keep what is yours." She said, "I learned this the slow way." She said, "I hope you can learn it faster." She hit send and put the phone down. Winter came. The river went gray. The basil died and came back and the grocery store rose. Grace put a small fake tree on a table and hung 3 silver ornaments and called it enough. Naomi brought cookies. They watched a movie where people learned something they should have known all along. They cried a little and called it the good kind. On a quiet night in December, Grace took the binder from the closet and removed one page, the letter she had written to herself. She taped it inside the cabinet where she kept her tea, so she would see it every morning when she reached for comfort. She added one line in a smaller hand at the bottom. It said, "You get to decide what being his wife means now." She closed the cabinet and smiled at the sound the hinge made. It was a small sound. It sounded like normal. In the spring, the library class asked Grace to speak for 10 minutes at the end of a session. She stood in front of 20 folding chairs and told a short story in a steady voice. She talked about a binder and a note from a notary and a cashier's check placed on a glass table. She did not say names. She did not say towns. She said what it felt like to breathe again. She said what it felt like to not apologize for standing up. She ended by holding up a plain notebook and saying, "This is not fancy. It is a way to hear yourself." People clapped in that soft way people clap when they are clapping for themselves too. After, a young woman waited while others talked, then came up and asked if it ever stops hurting. Grace answered with the only truth she knew. She said no, not all the way, but it stops deciding what you do next. The young woman nodded and held her notebook closer to her chest like it was warm. Years do not pass in this story, only seasons. But even in a small stretch of time, you can see how a life shifts when a person says, "I will not be erased." Grace learned to make soup without a recipe. She learned to fix the small leak under the sink. She learned the names of the women at the library who laughed like bells. She learned to sleep in the middle of the bed. She learned that the quiet she feared could be filled with things she chose. Sometimes she saw Margaret at the grocery store near the apples. They would say hello and talk for 90 seconds about weather and paper towels and nothing that would pull at old threads. Sometimes Margaret's eyes would wet. Sometimes Grace's hand would tighten on the handle of her basket. They would always leave each other with a nod and a small kindness, like, "You go ahead," or "Here, take this coupon." It was not a story with villains who stay villains. It was a story with people who made harm and then had to live with memory and with the chance to do better. On a summer evening, when the sky looked too wide to be true, Grace sat on the porch with Naomi and 2 glasses of lemonade. Crickets began their song. The streetlights clicked on, one by one, like someone practicing patience. Naomi asked how she felt now, all these steps later. Grace thought for a long time. Then she said something that surprised her with how right it was. She said, "I feel like a person whose life fits." Naomi raised her glass. They tapped the rims together. The sound was small and good. If you stood on the sidewalk then and looked up, you would see 2 women laughing without performance, a plant on a windowsill, a binder on a shelf, a photo on a mantle. You would see the ordinary glory of a life mended in daily ways, not by magic, not by a single day in a court, but by the stubborn practice of telling the truth and staying on your feet. And if you are a person listening to this story because your own life has a crack in the paint that runs from the window to the floor, maybe you would hear the most useful part last. You can be gentle and still be strong. You can be kind and still say no. You can love someone and still lock your door. You can put your name back on your own mail and expect it to arrive. You can tape a note inside a cabinet and make tea while you become the person who wrote it. Grace did not win a prize. She did not lose her softness. She learned to carry her softness like a blanket, not like a target. She learned that family can be a person with a key who knocks, and a neighbor who leaves soup on steps, and a woman in a store who says, "I see you." She learned that money is not love, and love is never theft. She learned that a small voice can still fill a room if it says the right thing at the right time on paper in front of the right people. One night, a wind from the ocean moved through town and made the flags crack and the trees whisper. Grace lay in bed and listened. She thought of the first email, the wrong address, the wrong date style, the right shape of a name. She thought of the woman she was then and the woman she was now. She let the wind talk over the roof and closed her eyes. Morning would come. It always did.
And in the morning, there would be coffee and a clean mug and a plant to water and a walk by the river and a life that belonged to her. That was enough. That was everything.